I will say that we can always decide if we want to clip things out of this recording, or if we decide not to post it at all. With a security working group, I figured that may be something that we want to decide as a group, and that's fine. I think that that's something that we can do. We have the ability to do so, of course. So thank you guys for being here for our first meeting for this working group. Let's go ahead and get started. Barney, if you want to go ahead and get started, let's just do a small round of introductions. Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. My name is Barney Sowood. I've been working with Salt for probably about last 3, maybe 4 years. In my day job, I work as a contractor. I subcontract for a former Salt Stack partner, now VMware partner in Europe. Generally, I work on helping people implement Salt Open. I have done some stuff with SSE and commercial parts of Salt. I'm really quite interested in sort of security side of things, obviously, and things like testing, and actually not just testing of Salt, things like testing of Salt states. So I do a lot of work around testing and CI with the customers I work with. Yeah, I mean, previous to working with Salt, I've been doing stuff with config management since the late 90s with CF Engine and various other config management from then on. So yeah. So yeah, that's my background.
That's great. Thanks, Barney. Alexander?
Yes, so I'm Alexander Grohl. I work for SUSE. On the one hand, we ship Salt inside of operating system, but I'm part of the SUSE Mentor team that also does Uni. So Uni is the open source upstream. SUSE Mentor is still open source, but you need a subscription to get the packages themselves. So we use Salt a lot. And therefore we contribute to Salt, and yeah, we ship it and have customers use it and support them as well. And also because we do a lot of release stuff ourselves, interested in not only the release process, but also the security side of things, because we also want to make sure that our products are secure.
Shane, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm Shane Lee. I've been with Salt since 2015. I work on the Windows side of the house. I've been working with the Windows working group, and I decided I wanted to come to this meeting last week, but I can't remember why now, but I'm here.
That's okay. You're here. It's good.
That's what the weekend. I did a brain dump over the weekend, apparently.
Yeah, that's okay. That's what you should be doing. Right. And I'm Sage Robbins. I'm the program manager. I've been with Salt Stack since early 2018. Prior to that, I was with EMC, Dell EMC. And then prior to that, I worked for a healthcare company in their IT world. And really just enjoy this. Definitely have an interest, and we'll see if we can get more people here. Today, I think we'll talk more high level, and we'll kind of go through the charter, and we can also go through some of the CVE retro artifacts if we have time. And we kind of talk about what we're going to do here. So I'll just show this. And Barney, if you want to even just walk us through a little bit, that's fine too. We can go through the charter.
Sure.
As it is today. There we go. Might be a little small.
Cool. Okay, so as we sort of briefly discussed before the meeting started, this was just some of my ideas once we had started discussing the possibility of a working group for security on what that might look like, what we could do, and how we could fit that into the sort of format that I think Sage has been putting together for the working groups. So one of the first things that I sort of think is probably quite important is that we need to be realistic about what work we can do and how much work we can do, especially given that we're going to be working on, with community members for a large portion of this, and looking at what we can do to essentially maximize the impact of what we're doing with the effort that we could actually put in. So just looking at the purposes, I think one of the things that when I started using Salt originally, I was, I guess, slightly surprised about was how, with a default install of Salt, how essentially the master needed to run as root, how the essentially to actually run any of the Salt CLI commands, you essentially needed to be root in the default install, and I think that's those sort of issues are quite are problems that I think we can solve hopefully relatively easily, and by doing so, essentially reduce the attack surface. And this sort of first purpose, ensuring when a user installs Salt, they get an installation that minimizes risk but doesn't impact their ability to use the full power of Salt. I think what I'm talking about there is whenever issues of running the Salt master as a non-root user, or not having to be root to run the Salt CLI commands and so on comes up, I think there's some resistance in terms of how setting that up will make things difficult for new users. There are steps, there's documentation already about how you can do that. It's not brilliant, but what I think I want to get at with that is we want to ensure that when a user comes and installs Salt, they get a system that is locked down as much as possible from a security point of view, but they're not then forced to go and turn off any controls or anything that we put in place in order to actually do some work, because obviously Salt's it's super powerful, and it's really good that when new users come to Salt and are able to get the work done that they want to do, that's awesome, and we don't want to get in the way of doing that. But I think, especially given what's happened over the last year or so with a number of vulnerabilities and CVEs, I think we need to be sort of taking the opportunity to say how can we improve the sort of default security posture of Salt installations for our users, both at the point of initial install, but also perhaps as per the second sort of point of the purpose, providing documentation that will actually help people to configure Salt so that they can do what they need to do with it, but they're not exposing themselves to security issues. So certainly with, it was one of the CVs last year, I think, where I think it was the first one that was Salt API related, where it turned out that quite a lot of people were actually exposing Salt API to the outside world. And although, yes, there is documentation that we've got that says don't do this and don't expose your masters to the outside world, I think just saying that in documentation, it's not really sufficient. We need to be making it so that when people install Salt, they're getting sensible settings out of the box that essentially help prevent them making mistakes like that. And then we also, where people want to make the decision to do things like run the Salt API, we give them, good documentation that gives them good ideas about how they can harden that. Perhaps covering things like, putting some sort of proxy in front of it, TLS, or these sorts of things. And yeah, so that we don't, I guess, when further security issues come up, because they will, by the nature of any very large and very complex open source projects, we'll find more issues. That actually it would be great if, when those issues come up, for 90% of our users, we find that actually they're not hit by that issue because the default install or the documentation we've given them means that they have mitigation in place already. So I think those are the sort of very, very high level what I would like us as a working group to be looking at.
Maybe just a small comment from us. So we do some of those things. So the salt user is already used on SUSE systems. I think there's some parts. So in general, it's not that things are broken, or at least not in your day-to-day usage. But I think there was something that doesn't fully work with it. But I haven't seen it personally or read about it. I think it was somewhere in the documentation saw that said if you use like a different user other than root, then this or that doesn't work. But yeah, so part of our packaging policy is not to have stuff run as root if not really needed. So that's patch number 1 that we have in our packages actually. But the oldest patch is to use the salt user. But yeah, this is something that we have some experience with at least. For AppArmor and SE Linux, it's also interesting, but it's also hard for Salt because it's so huge. And in the end, it will, at least for the minion side, it will do, I mean, a lot. So people see how, but I mean, I think it's still a good idea to work on those.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting to look at what you've done in terms of running as non-root router in your sort of packages. I think one of the important things to be clear about in what we're talking about here is I think we've got to be realistic that actually the initial work we do will probably focus on the master. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is that actually there really is no particularly great reason why you can't run the master as a non-root user. And also the master and related processes like Salt API are the processes that are potentially exposed to the network, and also most likely the processes that are going to be attacked because if you compromise a master, then you have access to all the minions. So I think in the future, doing work to improve security of the minion would be great, but I think again, sort of going back to what are the biggest gains we can get for our initial work, I think certainly looking at the master and Salt API are probably the areas we want to look at, and also those generally have been the areas where we've seen recent issues. So yeah. But it'd be great to look at what you're doing with your packages with the Salt user. As part of that as well, I know one of the issues that has been raised before regarding running the master as a non-root user is that it causes issues with PAM. So that if you want to do authentication of users, so if you're using Salt API, for example, and you want to use PAM, then there's issues if the Salt master doesn't run as root. But I mean, I think those problems are solvable, and also, I would, have more sort of time for that argument if we were actually, or if the project in general was encouraging people to use like the publisher or any of the sort of authentication systems, whereas actually by default we just tell people to run sudo salt rather than actually encouraging people to set ACLs. And I think that's also part of what I would like to see us do, start putting together in things like packaging, actually set up groups where you have some example groups with different sets of privileges installed as default, and people can then add their users to those groups, rather than just everyone who has access to Salt immediately being able to run essentially anything as root on any minion that's connected to the Salt master. I think we should, or my opinion is that we should be encouraging, like Salt is extremely powerful in terms of being able to give you essentially root level access to all your minions. And I think we should be encouraging users to think about that quite heavily and how they want to use it, rather than just assuming that it's fine that everyone has access to, be able to run any module. Because also there's, realistically, the modules within Salt that people can run, execution modules or state modules, I guess execution modules is mainly the issue, are very massively in terms of what they can do, and the risks involved in giving access to everyone who has access to your Salt master to specific modules. So I think, encouraging some, I don't really like the term best practice, but encouraging, some ideas within the user base in terms of what's a good idea to give people access to module wise and what's not. And that would link into perhaps giving example ACLs or setting up basic ACLs as part of doing package installs. So then just going on to the objectives and goals, Salt packages to configure all components, release possible privilege we talked about, and again, updating the Salt packages for file system permissions, groups, Salt, so users can use Salt without being recovered. AppArmor and SE Linux profiles, that's going to be quite distribution dependent, but in terms of limiting what the Salt master can do, I think that might be quite useful. I'm not sure if perhaps some of the issues around sort of Salt API and Salt SSH could have been where there's sort of command injection and things like that. I don't know whether or not you could actually put some useful limits in place. That's something would be, I think, quite good to explore. So yeah, review and improve existing documentation for securing Salt. There is some sort of Salt hardening stuff, which I think you could probably expand on considerably. And I think it would probably, I touched on this a little earlier, producing guides for securing and hardening Salt components like the API or 0MQ. And I think there was some discussion on the community meeting the other day about the core team looking at potentially alternative transports that would be a bit more robust to being exposed to the internet than 0MQ.
Yeah, we've discussed it, but not much more than that. It'd be advantageous for this group to take on, but I think that we could then propel that conversation further, which would be good.
Yeah, because again, it's I think just saying to people, you can't expose your Salt masters in any way to the internet.
Right.
Is one it's unrealistic to expect that everyone will get that right.
Yes.
Secondly, it's actually the idea of security is this like hard outer shell, soft inner, where basically as long as at your perimeter firewall you're blocking access to your Salt master then and Salt API, then that's fine. But it's not. Certainly customers I work with, it's when we've been concerned about bugs in things like the Salt API or Salt masters, it's not from people actually accessing them from the outside world, but it's where they might compromise a machine within a different zone, like a different production zone, or that's a a lower security zone, and then leverage that. And those machines may have access to the Salt master because they need to, and saying, well, you just don't expose the Salt master to anything dangerous. That's not realistic.
Sweeping.
Exactly. It's a simplistic sort of way of looking at it, I think.
And I think we could do a much better job in that documentation. And I think that it brings us to an interesting point too, that we've kind of gone in the direction with documentation recently where we're distributing it as well. And I think a lot of the hardening documentation we could also make as distributed docs somewhat, especially if we do some sort of tutorial of this is kind of your default, but if you want to navigate away from the default, here's a tutorial on where you can go with that. That probably wouldn't change much. over the years, so it could be separate from the code base.
One thing about documentation that I saw recently was, so I was looking into GPG encrypted pillars, and
Yes.
this tutorial that we have in the Salt documentation, I guess it works, but for our case, because Salt is a different user, we need to adjust the file permissions for the partner and so on and so forth. So these additional steps, that's something that I need to document anyway, if we want to. So I don't have to do it in like our downstream documentation, of course. This would be something that would be nice if you say, okay, if we do run as a different user, then in the case for GPG, it's very simple because I know the paths or what you want to set it up. But when we review the documentation, these are also things to look at. What file permissions problems do we run into if we don't use root? And then how do we adjust the documentation to mention that or to link to a place or however we want to set it up in the end?
Yeah, that's a good point. That one's kind of different. It would probably need to be embedded in the documentation, because I think that's probably where it's going to be seen. So, but there's a lot there that would need to be touched. Well, we'll just get started and we'll just work our way through it. That's the only way we can do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have covered a little bit of that in the risks, which we'll get to in a sec.
Yes.
But yeah. So yeah, produce and maintain guides, review of remotely accessible components for design issues and relevance. I put question marks next to this because I think this is potentially quite a big. It's not particularly well defined. It's quite a big job. What I was thinking of particularly in this context is the Salt API, because I like in my work I use the Salt API really heavily, and you know it's fantastically useful for the work that I do, and I'm sure for quite a lot of other people. Fundamentally though, and the sort of, you know, if you dig into documentation, it says this. It's a really, really thin wrapper around the Python API, and really thin in a, you know, do you really want to expose it to anything that's not very, very trusted? And I think we've seen some of the issues with that recently, you know, I think there are also some design decisions within that were made perhaps at a slightly different time. Certainly, you know, the fact that up until last year, for about a 3-year period, I think maybe possibly more, you could essentially run Salt SSH without authenticating against the API, if things were defined with the keys in the roster, and the fact that was, you know, possible to do for several years was, yeah, slightly scary. So, you know, it's, I think perhaps looking at things like the Salt API and going, you know, is this actually a reasonable design for current times in terms of an API that you're going to expose to any other systems? Is it too low level? I guess it would also be quite interesting to try and work out which bits of the Salt API people are actually actively using. You see, because I mean, you know, I've personally never used and never known any of my customers to use the Salt SSH part of it. And I actually think that part of it is really quite problematic, because, you know, you're taking essentially untrusted or semi-trusted input and you're building command lines and running those. And whilst, you know, problems have been found and problems have been fixed, that's clearly not been an easy process, because that's happened multiple times. You know, the problems have been fixed, and then it's been worked out actually they're not quite been fixed, or, you know, there have been issues, because, you know, that's a difficult thing to do safely.
Yeah,
Right.
Salt SSH of Salt API is one thing that we do for installing Salt in the first place. So the Uni product or solution is basically you want to control your data center, and a lot of it is patch management and mirroring repositories and that kind of thing. And we do build bootstrap repositories, what we call them, that contain salt and dependencies. And then we use salt SSH to install salt minion initially. And then we can control them over salt minion way. Or we can also, the user can also say we want to manage this just over salt SSH. So this is also something that we heavily use. So it's an area that we,
are you calling that via the Salt API component?
I think
because that's the specific issue.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Oh, you are interesting.
Because we don't. I have to double check, but I think we moved a bit away from Salt API, but I think that part is still.
Still using it in places. I'd be interested to understand that as well, because we don't always know that people are using Salt SSH, and we certainly don't know if they're using it through the Salt API. And those two things coupled together is a place where it's definitely been focused. And so it'd be good to understand that, especially as we move forward with Heist, which is, a dissolvable minion through a tunnel. And we've talked about Heist replacing Salt SSH. And some of us are like, is that even realistic? I don't understand that it is. I think that it could be, but it's not on parity today. And so there's some things there that even if whatever direction that we go towards, I think that it would be advantageous and probably bigger bang for our buck for this group to even say, here's some of the questions that we need to ask as we start moving forward with a project, whatever it is, if it's going to be using the Salt API or it's not, or if it's going to be using Salt SSH. As we go forward, how do we make this more secure? How are we going to implement this in a way so that as default, people can use it out of the box in a good way, like you were saying before? And that's something I think we could not spend a lot of time and effort on, and yet disseminate questions that we should be asking at that design level throughout that process much easier to gain that value. And so that's something I'd like to do probably sooner than later in this group, that we could kind of come up as you're looking at your designs, these are some of the questions you need to start asking yourself, especially not just, and I think this is probably the reason that Shane's here, is that if we start going down the Linux route, it's going to be kind of hard and fast this way, but we go across, Mac and Windows. And, so if we need to think about those other OSs as well, and it may even be different for SUSE than it is for other, Linux distributions. And so we want to dive into those a little bit to make that agnostic of the OS, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great that Shane's here actually, because certainly getting some understanding of how packaging on Windows is going to work, how, what users you can run the services as. I have used Salt on Windows, but, very little, and I certainly don't currently. So understanding how the ideas we may have in terms of sort of privilege separation and so on. I mean, I guess the sort of initial work we're talking about, it will be less so because you don't currently support the master on Windows, do you? It's minion only. So
it's true. We're really close though. So that work is happening in the background.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I guess it would then be good to sort of consider how, how we would get feature parity in terms of locking down the master on Windows as well. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I think things really change there. I don't completely, maybe Shane can talk to this. I don't completely understand where we are with testing some of that sort of more security related Windows on master, but I know that we have a breadth of testing going on that we're trying to get up and running and green so that we could then say we do support it.
Well, we're just trying to get all the tests that run on Linux to run on Windows for master.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're doing anything different security wise than we're doing on Linux, but Windows is different in the way it handles. I mean, it would run as a service, and in Windows, your services run as system. I mean, they're just
right.
Especially if you want it to have that kind of control things over. Though honestly, I don't know that the master would need to. No. The master just sending out command. The minion needs to run as system, but the master doesn't necessarily need to. There's probably some things that could be done there.
Yeah, so as we're looking at that, even though we're sort of already implementing and we've gone that way, it's the time to ask some of those questions and to really harden it.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be good for us in this group to say, so across the board, here's some things to think about as you're looking at the testing and you're looking at moving this forward, because we can also implement some, not just, I mean, we're doing some code sniffs, but we could even do, I think that we could do more on that like human level of, well, let's just think about this for a minute and let's ask ourselves these questions and walk through it. Plus that, I think it helps everybody to just walk through those security minded questions when you're thinking about design.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think possibly even things, you know, are there any sort of development guidelines that are security oriented that are published
For SALT?
Yeah.
Not more than what we've got out there for hardening.
Okay, just because of things like this last point, review of modules for security issues. One thing I had a bit of a look at recently was I got just a bit concerned about a particular module. I can't remember which one it was, about how it was how it was shelling out to run an executable. So I wanted to sort of understand how that worked. And what was commonly being done within execution modules to ensure that you know, shell injection wasn't easily possible. And looking at quite a few modules, it's clear that actually there are some patterns that are being used to ensure that shell injection is difficult or can't happen. But I couldn't find any documentation anywhere that said, if you're writing a module and you need to shell out, you should use, it's like the Python shell argument, isn't it?
Yeah, well, when you use Python shell true, you want to make sure you're, is it shellx, the command shellx, you're wrapping everything in quotes and trying to escape everything properly. And I think there's a library for that, but we've talked about it in the core team, and the people who are doing the merging, we're starting to pay more attention to when we see Python shell equals true, that there's some sort of command wrapping or something that's going on to try to avoid the shell execution issues.
Yeah, so I mean, I think making that clear to people in advance, great that that people are starting to try and catch that at merge time. That's really good. But I think sort of having some guidelines out there clearly that for people, so they can in advance go, well, I want to do this thing. Oh, that might be dangerous. Why is that potentially dangerous? How what is a simple pattern I can use to actually mitigate that issue? Yeah, and I also, a brief digression on that. I know you've started to use, sorry, I forget what's the name of the tool that's now doing static analysis of from a security
Bandit.
point of view. What's that? Bandit, that's it.
Bandit.
Can Bandit do tests along those lines? So could Bandit pick up things like unsafe use of Python shell?
I think so. We haven't configured it much beyond out of the box, and I think we have a lot of work that we could do and should do there, and we just haven't gotten quite that far yet. One of the community members that is using Bandit heavily, that we were in discussions with him about how he's using it, and we wanted to understand that. He broke his back, poor guy. So we've been like, you get better, and then we'll talk about this. That's more important. And so, but of course, if anybody else is using it or doing other things with it, we'd love to hear about it. And of course, there's other tools we could be using as well.
Sure.
But I do think that's a good point. We don't have, I think that we use the same set of questions to write a PR as to review a PR. And they're just sort of like questions to get you thinking. And I was looking at that recently and would like to separate that out and make those more robust, especially on the development side of it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's I think we've covered these sort of objectives and goals. Oh yeah, that's Shellax, yeah. Cool.
So we should probably document the use of that and say,
yeah,
hey, if you're going to use Python shell equals true, then you need to use this library to avoid shell injection.
because if you use Python shell equals false, which is the default, isn't it? That essentially goes through shellx anyway, doesn't it? If I understand it.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it does. I think a little while ago I looked into the command mod, and I think that's what it actually does. So yeah, so I guess there probably isn't a good reason, or people would have to have quite a use.
The other issue is sometimes you need to shell something out and it's hard coded and it's not accepting user input or anything from a state, but if it's going to accept anything from a user or allow a user to put something in, then it needs to go through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually just there's a sort of, I guess, further issue from the point of view if you start to encourage people to actually use things like the publisher ACL to limit what modules people can use. That there's quite a few modules that do things like allow you to pass as an argument what CLI tool to use. So for a customer a little while ago, I was working on some stuff that uses like this. They use JBoss, and there's some JBoss modules, and you, as part of invoking the execution module, you pass the JBoss CLI command path that you want to use, which is fine as if you trust everybody that's running that. But if you want to say lock down to certain users being able to use certain modules, but those modules are written in such a way that you can pass in an arbitrary path for something to run to them, then that's quite problematic. But I think given the sort of general, the general approach of you give people access to Salt, they can run whatever they want, that's, doesn't really necessarily get thought about in all the modules.
Well, we have a few. Just in execution modules, there are 526. So it's a lot of review.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, but if we have some better like the process at merge time, then that will at least stop new ones from coming in. So and that's an easier step, like cost-wise, than going through all the modules that we have already.
That's true. And as we're looking at updating modules that are going into Salt extensions, we do want to look at those heavily as we move them to make any changes to make them more secure as well, and making sure that as we're reviewing some of those, that we're also sort of looking at something that may be on the periphery of those that could be deprecated, that may not be being used at all, or don't have a reason to be used, haven't been touched in a while or whatever.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, should we just finish off going through the rest of the chart then, if that's okay with everyone? So yeah, I think briefly risks. I think we've discussed some of this. Actually, changing how installation is done, how default functionality works is potentially going to be some problematic in some ways because people are used to working in a certain way, and also we would need to think about how that change functionality is introduced for existing installations. So if people are doing upgrades, we don't suddenly want to break everyone's upgrade. So I guess that's something that we probably need to work with the release group quite heavily with. Next one, we some known issues around panel authentication running masters non-root. As I said, I think we can solve those issues, but we'll need a bit of thought. And yeah, the final one, there might be some resistance against significant changes on how default salt installations work, because people don't like change. So that's fair enough. And then yes, in the milestones, I mean, that's essentially just reiterates some of the with a bit more detail, some of the things that I was suggesting that we might want to work on. Yeah, and finally, returns measurement. Yeah. So essentially, yes, secure default installs, and you know, we're not getting secure default installs, but then having everyone just turn those things off to get it either back to how it used to be, or to enable them to do what they need to do, because you know, I think we would have failed if that's what's happening. Actually get people, you know, using and recommending the documentation. Certainly when you know, when there are CV releases or other issues, actually, you know, seeing people point to the relevant documentation that we produce, I think would be, you know, demonstrate we were doing the right things. Future CVs are mitigated for users using the default package config. Obviously, you know, that's not always going to be the case. We can't, you know, we can't guarantee that in any way, but if we can increase the number of users who aren't affected by you know, any particular CV, then that would be great. And also, I guess, reduce the severity of any effect. And then, yeah, I guess quite a lot of that, those things cover, you know, users with quite standard use cases, but obviously, especially with something like salt, you know, people come up with lots of very, very different use cases, and but often much more complex use cases. So I think where people, you know, and I think this comes back to we can't just tell people that, you know, they can't possibly expose their salt master to anything dangerous or anything semi-trusted or untrusted. Realistically, you know, people need to some degree to do some actual useful work. So how do we, you know, this would be that people are actually using our documentation or guides or whatever to actually help them with that, and also potentially, you know, other improvements such as the you know, improvements to transport we were talking about. So yeah, that's it.
So I think a lot of this aligns with sort of higher level what I wrote in the artifact for actions for the CVE, and we can align some of them. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we have a lot of time to go over that, but I'll take an action to look at that and then fill in a couple of things here for participants and roles and responsibilities and project board. And then anything else from that, it's actually right here, the artifact. I think that I'll just make it more explicit that we're going to be working with the groups. And I don't know that I need to do more than that exactly, maybe a few other things, and looking to point to this, and then of course pointing from the actions here as well that came out of March 11th working groups.
Just one question, if that's okay, on the sort of working on the release plan and communication, which is something, if you just go back, yeah, just go back to the CVE. Yeah, so you've got develop security release process and communication plan. How do you sort of see that working? Is that going to be something that is built perhaps on top of the work that the release group are doing, or, you know, so yeah, will that be built on top of the work the release group are doing? And also, how will we sort of work with the core team, i.e. the people that are actually going to be doing that release, in order to make that happen? Yeah,
so we do currently have a release process and a communication plan that goes specifically with just a regular release, and then to say, and that we have one that's separate, that's for security, does exist. We've kind of kept it behind closed doors. We're going to expose that a little bit more so that these working groups can see that, and also help us to develop it and make it more robust. A lot of what this a lot of what I want to do here is to make it more transparent so that we can then work with the community to make it more robust. That's where I think that we've faltered in the past, is that we've kind of kept things a little bit hidden or just said things really high level. We have a process, we don't really expose it, but to really make that work happen out in the open. Because I think that it can, and that's not going to hurt anything. I don't think that that exposes us in any way. Although I'd be interested to dive into that a little deeper. I think that what we have today is is fairly robust. And I'm happy to share that with you guys. I actually want to share it with I did share it with the release group previously, what we have, and it's extensive, but could be more so. And what I'd like to do is, instead of keeping it behind closed doors into like I have it in a Confluence page, is to put it into an issue template that's like, here's sort of our release process and the checklist that we go through. Here's who does what. And here's some of the things that we need to, the dependencies that need to happen. So this needs to happen before we can say that we move on, and make that a template that we reuse just for releases. And it would be very similar for a CVE, only that it'd be happening sort of behind closed doors, and there would be, this embargo happening with the packagers and everybody else that's part of those processes. But to have it be a similar process makes it more repeatable, makes it more makes us faster. And then we can also look towards automation. We don't have a ton of automation in place there. We have a little bit. And so part of that is like, we know we want to automate it. We simply haven't had the resources to do so. So opening that up to the community, I think, is probably one of the fastest ways for us to make sure that happens.
Great.
Yeah, so it'll happen in parallel. And we'll just, we did have the scrum of scrums that happened on Friday. And I know that time doesn't happen at a good time for you. So I'm looking to make sure that we could do that possibly at just a separate time.
What time was that?
It was 8:30 my time, so 9:30 Mountain, which would be, is it 3:30 UTC?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, well, that would
But
be
on a
okay on a Friday.
Does that work?
Generally, that would be okay.
Okay, good. I don't love
Yeah.
Friday either, though. It's
Yeah.
And it would be fine to separate it from that, from the planning meeting that we already do that's internal. Not a problem. We simply coupled it together because we weren't sure where to put it.
Yeah, fair enough.
But we could even do that at a separate place and time. There's some other people that didn't join because I don't know that works for them either, that are US time, just simply because it's morning on a Friday for them. So I'm not sure if that works out or not.
Cool.
But that is definitely a place where we can do some things together. I think that it would be advantageous for us, definitely, like Alexander's with the release group. And if you can attend that one, Barney, great. If not, we'll look to those of us that are going to that to bring it back to this. Should be fine. I am going to eventually get to focus on release management. And so that should also really help for me to be in the two groups to say, so this is kind of our adjusted process, and this is what it looks like, and really do some focus there. So I'll be your go-between.
Great.
And hopefully that helps us. Well, I think this is a good start.
Yeah.
Welcome, Gareth.
No.
I saw that you joined.
Hey, everyone.
Hey,
Hi, guys.
Go ahead, Barney. Were you going to say?
I was just going to say, will you set up an issues board then for the working group and those sorts of things? Cool.
Yeah, I'll put the links in here.
Yeah, great.
So that we've got it, and where any meeting notes that we do, I prefer a board to meeting notes.
Sure.
I think it's easier to work from, and I'll put that in there as well.
Great.
Well, good. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you all for being here. We'll meet again next month, and I definitely have some things to follow up on. This is going to be great.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for organizing it.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye, guys. See you next month,
Bye.
if not
See you.
before.